So today's lecture is going to be on frontier life, so dealing with the western part of the U.S. again, more like what is going on in this territory. We dealt with a little bit before with Jackson and purchasing this stuff during the Mexican-American War, or basically taking it during the Mexican-American War. But today we're going to be dealing with more like the social issues and what is going on in this area. So we're going to be dealing with Unit 4, questions 1 through 11, so you can flip to that in your packet. So the first thing, so we had already pushed a large group of Native Americans out here, so that's when we talk about the Trail of Tears with Andrew Jackson. So we're pushing these Native Americans out there, but there are also a large group of Native Americans already there. So, but during this time period, we also see a huge decline in their culture, and that's mainly due to U.S. efforts to make them decline. So, but the first thing that contributed to their decline, so dealing with question number 1, is the attempts to assimilate. So assimilates this idea is we're going to try to make Native Americans more like regular Americans, so people with European ancestors. So as you can see in this picture to the right, this is a group of Native American children at an assimilation school. So they actually set up schools out west that were trying to teach Native Americans and specifically Native American children to act more like European immigrant, or not necessarily European immigrants, but individuals in the U.S. who were considered basically the right way to act. So they're dressed in proper English attire at this time, so they're trying to make them look, sound, and act more like Americans. So they try to blend in better with the rest of the U.S. The problem with this is they have their own culture. They are not like the rest of the U.S., and that is not necessarily a bad thing. So this is a time period where you're trying to bring these people in, but you're also sort of taking away their culture. The other thing that dealt with the decline of Native American culture were the land constraints. So during this time, there's a lot more people going out west, and that's constraining how Native Americans are able to utilize the land in which they want to. As you remember, they used to have a lot more freedom over this area before settlers started coming out there. Now people are starting to make claims on lands. They're starting to sort of take away those old lands that the Native Americans still want. So that's another way of taking away some of the culture of Native Americans. During this time period, we also want to deal with how they were being perceived in everyday life. So there's one individual, Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote a book. It's called A Century of Dishonor. And this dealt with, basically, she was advocating for the U.S. government to change its policies toward Native Americans. As you can see from the title, that's her, basically she's saying for a century we have disrespected this group of people and it's time for a change. And she actually did a really cool thing where she actually spent her own money, bought a lot of these books that she wrote herself, and sent one to each member of Congress trying to change their mind. So this is one person who is really advocating for changing the way we act towards Native Americans during this time. But even though this is all was going on, there's still legislation being passed that was really taking advantage of Native Americans. So the first one of those is Indian Appropriations Act of 1871. So this was basically the U.S. government saying, okay, Native Americans, you can no longer make treaties with us individually. So we're not going to recognize you as one tribe or another. We're all going to group you as wards of the government. So if you've ever heard that word ward, it's basically meant you are under the control of the government. You are a ward of the state. Now they are a ward of the government. So basically saying we're going to group you all together and we're going to deal with you as a group rather than the individual tribes that you really are. And the second piece of legislation that you might need to know is the Dawes Act. So this is dealing with question number 2. So the main purpose of it was another attempt to assimilate Native Americans into what was considered the right way to act, or the American way of life. So basically what it did was it divided up Indian land into individual plots. So basically, like we think of today, a plot of land, and basically they handed these out to Native American families, trying to get them to act more like American settlers who were moving out west, so farming a designated amount of area. So continuing this assimilation trend. The problem was it was also a way for the U.S. to take back some of the land they had already given Native Americans, because the U.S. government was deciding how they were going to section off these lands and give them away. But the way they did it, there was excess land, and obviously after that, when there's excess land, they took it and sold it to settlers moving out west. So it's a way of sort of restricting some of that land that they had already given Native Americans and sort of selling it for a profit. But another attempt to assimilate. A big invention during this time, so as we mentioned, we had a lot of people moving out west. So, like cattle farming has become a huge industry. So, because not all this area is perfect for farming the way we think of like crops, so they're starting to work to really raise cattle in these areas. So, before you had this idea of branding. So, there is branding where uh, a farmer would brand his cattle, so put a hot iron on the cattle with some kind of marks to distinguish them from another farmer's cattle. But the big invention during this time that helped out, it basically made containing your herd possible was barbed wire. So this seems like such a common thing, such a basic thing, but you have to remember, I mean, that's got to come from somewhere. And barbed wire, this is where you first really see barbed wire being used. So the main thing was it was a lot cheaper. So imagine trying to fence in these hundreds of acres of land where your cattle are roaming. Number one, that's going to be really expensive, and number two, it's going to be very time constraining. Barbed wire was a much cheaper option. It was a lot easier to set up. All you'd have to do, put a post in the ground, wrap the barbed wire a couple times, and then just keep going. So this idea of sort of making it cheaper, but it's also a way of keeping your cattle contained. So you're not having as much issues with them getting mixed up with another farmer's cattle, and you're also being able to keep a tighter eye on them. So you're not allowing thieves the opportunity now to get your cattle, and you're also being able to protect them a little more from predators as well. So we talked about assimilation. So some of these Native Americans during this time were agreeing with assimilation and going into these schools, but they're also groups of Native Americans who were fighting back, who were not willing to assimilate. They wanted their way of life, they wanted their land, and they resisted the U.S. government. So the first of one of these battles is the Battle of Little Bighorn. So hopefully you've heard of this before. This is one of the biggest Native American victories in U.S. history. So it's a really, really famous one. So it was in 1876, and it was dealing with the Sioux Indians. So basically, the Sioux chief Sitting Bull had a vision of an Indian victory. So he basically had these dreams that the Indians were going to dominate the American forces. So basically, there was a general as well for the Indians named Crazy Horse. So he led the Sioux against General Custer and actually completely destroyed General Custer, because mainly Custer did not believe the Indians were going to be able to fight back as well as they did. So he was very overconfident and was very surprised. And this is what you hear as Custer's last stand, because his forces were destroyed by these Sioux Indians. But after this, you see a much bigger emphasis on the U.S. government really trying to put the brakes on these Native American victories. So they don't want to see them win again. There's a lot more emphasis on really winning these conflicts. And that's what you see at Wounded Knee. So Wounded Knee is almost 15 years after Little Bighorn. It's about in 1890. It's also dealing with the Sioux Indians. So this is at the end of the war with the Sioux Indians. The federal troops are coming into these, basically, these Sioux lands and trying to collect guns, trying to get these guns away from Native Americans and stop Native Americans from fighting back. So we have a large group of Sioux Indians there, and federal troops coming in trying to take guns. Well, one member of the army at this time tries to take a Sioux Native American's rifle. There's a scuffle that breaks out, and a shot is fired. No one really knows who shot first. No one really knows where this bullet came from. But all we know is after that one fire, the U.S. Army opened fire on these Sioux Indians at this sort of meeting place and killed over 300 Sioux Native Americans. So this wasn't just men. This wasn't just soldiers in the Sioux tribe. This was men. It was women. It was children. So this was a very, very black eye for the U.S. government. It was also a huge hit for the Sioux tribe. So it mainly debilitated their group for fighting back, and it was basically a big black eye for the U.S. So basically, they just annihilated this group of Indians. So now that we're going to move sort of away from Native Americans now and deal with what was actually going on the frontier. So what was life like? So we talked about Native American culture declining for several reasons, but we also have a population growth. So there's actually more people out there, as you'd guess, because more people are moving there. And one of the big reasons for that was the Homestead Act, which allowed people to claim land in this area and really start to improve it. So you have more people wanting the land. You have incentives to move west, so that's another thing. So you have this ability to get land. So you have a lot of incentives to go out there and sort of start your own homestead, to really build your own way of life. And also a big thing that contributed to this was immigration. So we'll talk about that usually probably next week. But immigration was going on. This was a huge time of immigration, so you have a lot more people coming into the country and people sort of moving around because of it. So you have people moving out of the Northeast because either they want the opportunity to go out west, or maybe they don't agree with these immigrants coming into where they've been living. So this idea of really going out west, sort of having your own way of life out there. So actually, how did these people get out west, and what was the journey like? So this was obviously, by the question, you see there are a lot of obstacles to getting out west. The first major obstacle was money. So this costed a lot of money to get out west. This was not something that everyone could do. So railroads made it cheaper, but generally it's still a sort of covered wagon sort of deal. So it costs a lot of money because you have to, number one, buy the wagon, buy the pack animals, so something to pull, the donkeys, the horses, things like that, and then the supplies to get out there. Because this was not a short journey. This took a long time to get out there. So another thing that stood in their way was the actual physical danger. So you have one type of danger in that animals, sort of bears, wolves, are always a threat to not only the humans on this journey, but the animals, the other animals, so your horses and any other animals that are coming with you. Then you have other individuals who could pose danger to you. So thieves who would sit on these trails and try to rob these caravans of covered wagons coming through. And then the other thing is just the natural barriers that are out there, so rivers and things of that nature, because people packed their whole lives into these wagons, so everything they own. So these are usually very heavy wagons because people usually put a little too much in them. So it's very easy for them to tip over. It's very easy for them just to sink in these rivers. So it's a very treacherous journey, and there's a lot of obstacles out there. The other thing that could stop you is sickness. So this is a very strenuous journey as well. So it took a lot of time, and it was very hard on individuals, and a lot of people got sick, and a lot of people died on this journey. To be honest, it was very hard. You'd have starvation. You'd have people being bit by snakes and other animals. I mean, there's a lot of ways to get sick and die on these things. So it was not a very good time for some individuals on these trips. So the last slide here is dealing with government involvement. So the government's really pushing for this movement out west. They really want to expand. So the first thing, so dealing with number 7. So how did the government support the growth of railroads? So the Transcontinental Railroad was a huge thing during this time. So they wanted to connect the east and the west coast, bring them together, provide a line of transportation for the country to get from the east coast to the west coast. So the way they did this was by actually literally giving money to companies to build them and the land to do it. So they made it very cheap for companies to build railroads. They made it very easy. So that's one way they were involved during this time period. And the other thing is the land distribution policy. So this is what we were talking about a little earlier with the Homestead Act. So number 8. So what was the purpose of the Homestead Act? And mainly it was to settle the West. It was this idea of getting people out west and settling these lands. And the big thing you need to do, so you need to do 3 things for you to basically fulfill the obligations of the Homestead Act. And it was to file an application for a deed. So basically file an application to get the land. You had to improve the land, which means you couldn't just leave it sitting, you couldn't just hold it. You actually had to go out there and do something on it. And then you had to reside on it for at least 5 years. So that someone had to live on it. You couldn't just hold it and basically just sit on it with no one actually living on it. So it was this idea of not just letting prospectors and individuals like that buy all the land up, but it was actually getting people on this land and living on it. So another way also, as you can see on the slide there, advertising was a big thing. You'd see a lot of flyers for really pushing for the ideas of moving out west and really having your own land. And the final thing for this lecture is social changes. So there was good and bad during this era. So we have social class. So add towards social class change during this time period, you have a lot more individuals taking advantage of some of these opportunities. So you have more people being able to move out west. You have more people voting. So voting is a huge issue about social class. It was spreading because you want to populate these states. You want to give them a say, and voting comes along with that. Women's rights are also something that are a little bit good and bad during this time period. So women's rights, you also see a bigger push for voting. You see things of that nature. But you also have the standard female roles coming into play too. So once these individuals getting out west, you see women living in the house, taking care of that kind of thing. So you sort of see these gender roles being stereotyped as well. So there's good and bad for both social class and women's rights during this period. And that's about all for today. So that is it.